I'm Bill Walton, and we're talking today about America's critical dependence upon China for our life-saving drugs. Millions of Americans are taking prescription and over-the-counter drugs made in China and don't know it, and neither do their doctors. These are prescription drugs in the legal supply chain that are distributed to U.S. hospitals, sold in corner drugstores and grocery store pharmacies, and distributed to military hospitals and clinics around the world. We cannot make aspirin in the United States. We cannot make penicillin in the United States, nor can we make genetic antibiotics. China's aim is to become the pharmacy to the world and is on track to achieve it. I've asked Rosemary Gibson and Frank Gaffney to join me on today's show to talk about this dangerous problem we have. Rosemary is the author of China RX, Exploring the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, and Frank is vice chairman of the Committee for the Present Danger China. Together, they've got a very good handle on what the issues are and what to do about it. The issues with China are no longer just about trade. Rather, it's vital national security issues and increasingly, as we've seen in this pandemic, our health.
If you think about it, if you control medicines, and among those you control antibiotics, you control the world. We're concerned about a virus. It's infectious. But bear in mind, if there were a bacterial infection, we can't make antibiotics here in the United States anymore.
I don't mean to be an alarmist, but I don't think this problem can be overstated. I think we all know the old story about how you boil a frog. Well, frog, if it sees a pot of hot water and you throw it in, the frog rationally jumps right out. But if you put the frog in the water while it's still cool and bring it up to heat over time, well, then you've got a boiled frog. Unfortunately, when it comes to our critical medicines, I think we're becoming increasingly in a position of that frog.
Here we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And let's take the medicines that would be needed right today in hospitals for people being treated with severe cases. So people will need sedatives if they have to be on a ventilator. They might need antibiotics if they get a bacterial infection. They might need epinephrine or dopamine to raise their blood pressure if they're collapsing. These are the bread and butter medicines in our medicine cabinets in hospitals. These aren't the shiny, the brand new drugs. These are the basic bread and butter ones that have been around for years. To make them, China controls 90% of the core chemicals. So here we have a situation where you have a global pandemic and the whole world depends on a single country for those core chemicals to make critical drugs.
This did not happen by chance. China's been engaged for decades on a very, very clear strategy of how to take over a given industry. And what they do typically is they subsidize companies based in China, subsidize them so that they can drive the price of their products way, way down so far that United States companies can't compete, and once the United States companies either withdraw from the market or move their facilities to China or some other so-called low-cost country, we've moved the production out, and then what happens then is China, not surprisingly, begins to raise the price.
We cannot make aspirin in the United States because China's companies formed a cartel, dumped it on the global market, and drove out all the producers. So we can't make the core chemicals in our aspirin. It's when we lost our last penicillin plant. And it's the same playbook. This isn't just because China's cheaper. It's not because of weaker regulations. But there's a cartel formation that is illegal under US law. But no one ever took Chinese companies to task for violating US antitrust law.
But it's not just about our dependence on China for these drugs per se. It's also about the question of what's the quality of the drugs coming out of China. In medicines in the United States, we have the FDA inspectors to go in to make sure that everything is being manufactured to our quality standards. In China, that's a lot less easy to bring about, and often our inspectors are blocked from being in China, where they have all sorts of incentives to not be as tough on Chinese plants as they are here in the United States.
Right now, there are no FDA inspectors in China because as federal employees, they were pulled back, which is the wise thing to do given we want to protect their health and safety. But China has made it very difficult for federal government to ensure the safety of products made in China. Think about this. You are a federal employee and you have a lot of great technical knowledge on how to make medicines. And you go into a plant there and you write up a report that says, here are all these deficiencies. You're the person that's stopping potentially a very large Chinese company from sending product to the United States. Do you think the Chinese government would ever want to give you a visa again to come back?
Another aspect of this that helps to understand how thorny this problem is that China is not what we call a, quote, rule of law society. And certainly it doesn't recognize any law outside of China and doesn't recognize international law. And so that comes to recognizing who's responsible for the efficacy of drugs or the safety of drugs. China will not take responsibility.
2 years ago, there was a blood pressure medicine that was sold to millions of Americans and people around the world. It had carcinogens in it. And the Chinese product had more than 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. So China's view is, and I write about this in China RX, that the attitude is one of the reasons our products are so cheap is because we assume no liability for them. And once you become dependent on a single country, it's take it or leave it because you have no choice. And we've done that. We have already started to do this, Bill, that we have in the United States of America, our federal agency is in the position of having to balance out having some supply versus having some substandard products on the market.
If there's something that you could call a silver lining of the pandemic that we're going through is it's woken America up to the issues that we face with being this dependent on China for critical drugs. And it also brings to highlight that China's not really been acting as our friend, and there are people, and I guess I'm one of them, that thinks that China is using this pandemic to further its own global ambitions. And some people worry, and I think we do need to be worried about whether they would do anything to deliberately contaminate our drugs.
And I've had doctors tell me that they are losing trust in the generic drugs that they're giving to their patients, because I don't want to scare people, but some of them say, I see these medicines and they don't seem to be working as they should. This is a gateway for the public to understand what's really going on with China and the fact that you want to withhold medicines from people and send them contaminated product. The narrative is there. So I hope it is a way and a means of waking up our country.
This is not just a problem for America. This is also a problem for Europe. I'll let Rosemary explain.
There was one plant in China that blew up, and there was a global shortage of a very important antibiotic to treat sepsis. And the regulators in Europe said, we're going to allow this to come into Europe, and the FDA did too, but the Europeans said it doesn't meet standard, but because we have no choice. So globalization has been a form of de facto deregulation and a diminution in the standards that Americans have come to expect.
The thing we need to realize is that our medicines are not just made in one place, both ingredients produced from one place. They're produced with ingredients made all over the world. And when you look at the labels on our bottles of pills, you look at it and it says distributed by XYZ, but it often doesn't tell you where it's manufactured. Even if it tells you where it's so-called manufactured, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where it's all made. Made in America may not mean made for America.
There was a federal circuit court case in D.C. that determined, it was around the VA. The VA has a provision under the Trade Agreements Act that they could only buy from certain designated countries. And that pertained to the core, what they call active ingredient. That's what makes a medicine medicine. And under that Trade Agreements Act, the federal government would have to buy only from designated countries. It could not buy from China. And guess what that court decision just did? It reversed that. It said if the API is made in China, but if the drug is finished, turned into a pill or a vial here in the United States, it can still be labeled as made in the United States.
The plight we find ourselves in with our medicines is not just about the medicines. It's a part of a global strategy that China's been engaged in for decades. It goes all the way back to Deng Xiaoping, who said they were not going to lose a Cold War the way the Soviets had lost a Cold War. Frank Gaffney explains.
And then he said, and this was to, trusted party cadre colleagues, there is now going to be a new Cold War between the United States and China will win this one. And I think from that moment forward, with the enunciation of what came to be known as his hide and bide strategy for achieving the kind of integration that Rosemary's just talked about.
America's decades-long strategy with China to contain China, going all the way back to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, has been to bring China into the liberal world trade order. The thinking was if we free trade with China, reduce barriers to trade, they will become a richer country, more dependent on us and with supply chain and cultural exchanges. And as time goes on, we would see China look a lot more like a democratic Western democracy. Well, this didn't work. Turns out the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party had a much bigger plan that had very little to do with the liberal Western democracy.
They had no interest in actually just being another nation in the great, international community. They wanted to be. They've set their sights on becoming, and they are well on their way towards actually achieving their goal of world domination.
Frank believes, and I think I pretty much agree with them, although I don't think it was our intent, but Wall Street, the U.S. capital markets have been tremendously important to the Chinese, and they've taken advantage of those capital markets to raise capital and finance companies which sell things or do things which may or may not be in America's best interest. I think as we're waking up to this will change, but we do need to take a look at how the Chinese are using the U.S. capital markets, and we're not talking about millions of dollars, we're talking about trillions of dollars. It requires a pretty hard look.
We have been enabling this, not just our companies that have been looking for the lowest labor costs that can allow them to eke out some marginal advantage, some profit. I'm talking about Wall Street. You mentioned $6 billion, Rosemary. That's obviously a huge number, but it's a tiny fraction of what American capitalists have been sending in the way of stocks and bonds investments to China. By some estimates, it's $3 trillion all in. And they're coming back, we're told, for $3 to $5 trillion more. If that money isn't made available to the Chinese Communist Party, and that's effectively who we're subsidizing here, we're going to be able to deny them the money to do some of the things that Rosemary's chronicled, as I said, but also a whole host of other things that involve, among other them, building weapon systems with which to kill us. This is truly insane.
Another thing that's been on people's minds, and Donald Trump has certainly brought this to the forefront, are jobs lost to China. That's certainly true, but we need to be clear that these are not just low-wage manufacturing jobs. These are much, much higher level research and development jobs in the case of the pharmaceutical companies. And in one case, Merck took its R&D staff and moved a big chunk of them to China. I think in the last couple of years, they built a $1.5 billion research and development facility in Beijing.
China is ramping up quickly from making the chemicals to the finished drugs to doing the R&D, and to their credit, they want to have medicine for their 1 billion people. But our US-based headquarter companies are investing billions of dollars in research capability in China, as we have lost tens and thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of STEM jobs that are the future of our country. And this is part of China's plan to address and go after and take over, disrupt, dominate, and displace 20 different sectors of our economy that are the future. Without that, we have no economy.
So when we begin looking for solutions, we need to start looking at the behavior of the U.S.-based multinational corporations that operate all over the world. They've made a lot of decisions that may have made sense for their shareholders, but they certainly didn't make a lot of sense for the United States. And these are not just economic decisions, these are decisions which bear on our national security and also increasingly our health.
I think that what we're watching here is symptomatic of, well, divided loyalties is how I would put it. They're more loyal to the profit opportunities than they are to the American people. And we've just seen how President Trump has, I think, quite properly treated 3M over this decision that it was going to sell masks that Americans need to the Chinese or others overseas. And he didn't take it well. As he said, he was going to get even uglier over this kind of thing. And I think everyone should be on notice that this is a matter of national security as well as public health. And if we treat it that way, the business as usual arrangements that have gotten us in this fix, as Rosemary's done such a brilliant job documenting, are not tolerable any longer. They must be ended.
There are some opportunities here, big ones. It turns out that in the last couple of decades, the economics of manufacturing have changed, in part due to productivity improvements, in part due to what I would call management techniques. People have gotten smarter about how to do these things. And in many cases, much of the manufacturing, which we've taken offshore to China and also other places, could profitably be brought back to the United States, and we wouldn't necessarily pay a price with higher prices for our products. Black & Decker CEO recently said they brought their manufacturing facility back from Mexico to the United States, and they found out they could make their products cheaper and better here than there. And those same kind of opportunities exist in the medicine supply chain and all the different places in which our drugs are manufactured.
Now, small businesses here in the United States, unlike the multinationals, are ready to go, and they want to make product, the critical drugs that we need here in the United States. They want to use innovative technology. These are the new innovators, and we've got to allow them room in this marketplace to be able to make it and to sell their product. And we're getting into solutions here, but just a preview, we can actually make generic drugs here in the United States faster, cheaper, with a much smaller environmental footprint and real-time quality control.
It's going to take some real political will to tackle this problem. Peter Navarro, who is President Trump's trade advisor in the White House, is arguing so far as we need an executive order to require certain things to be manufactured in America. I personally certainly would hope we don't need to do that. But on the other hand, if you look at the constituency among all the economic actors who don't want to see things change, we're going to have to get tough on this, and it may mean something like an executive order.
Dr. Navarro's been talking about an executive order to have the DoD, VA, and HHS buy critical drugs made in the United States, at least to get that manufacturing capability going. It's quite remarkable. Someone sent me, and I saw it in the media, a draft letter to the White House opposing Buy American for the military and the VA, saying it would destabilize the medicine supply chain.
The other line of action involves getting Congress involved, and I think steps are already underway to mandate Buy America in the U.S. military, and that would mean $5 to $10 million guaranteed customers, which would support a lot of manufacturing efforts here in the United States.
Bill, one of the recommendations I made last summer to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, just to get things going, is to have, where Congress has authority, have the Department of Defense, the VA, and the Health and Human Services Department. We have an $8 billion strategic national stockpile that includes critical drugs. That we use the procurement dollars now that we spend to buy medicines made here in the United States, at least to start it for critical drugs. You know, people say, oh, there's a list of 20 critical drugs. Everybody wants to know what they are. I have an idea of what they are. I don't have the official list, but it's pretty obvious. This is bread and butter stuff you need to run your healthcare system. Enable the DoD to cut through the red tape to allow the federal agencies to buy medicines and to support products made in the United States. That would be a huge step forward. You've got 10 million people covered by the Department of Defense, another 10 million in the VA, 20 million people. Just get those contracts going. It's one thing to have manufacturing here, but you need people to buy them.
Maybe at this point, I want to bring in my view, my personal view, that we've got to be very careful about xenophobia. Our fight is not with the Chinese people. They're 1.4 million people, and our fight is not with them. Instead, our fight is with the Chinese Communist Party. There are 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, but it's essentially controlled by a 7 or 8 member Politburo, and they call all the shots in what one of my guests, Claude Kitchen, is called techno-totalitarianism. So when we think about lines of action to buy in America, make in America, mandate the military to buy here, it's not aimed at the Chinese people, but it is aimed at a geopolitical foe in the Chinese Communist Party. And so we need to engage in a little realpolitik here. And as a recovering free trader, which is what I guess I call myself, I was for a lot of these offshore manufacturing because it made economic sense. But what made economic sense 10, 15, 20 years ago doesn't make sense in terms of our national security, our health, and basically the social fabric of America.
We did a poll, a national poll, before this pandemic really set in. Even then, not just at the top line level, but the demographic subgroups of that poll of 1,000 likely voters in the 2020 election, overwhelmingly and uniformly, were deeply concerned about China and very uneasy about the idea that anybody would be recommending more of the business as usual that's gotten us in our present parlous fix with them.
So here we are. It's time for change. We've now been woken up to a lot of practices which have put us in jeopardy. Again, I want to stress this is not with the Chinese people, but certainly we are at war with the Chinese Communist Party, and we need to act like that. As Frank points out, there's a lot of support among Americans to develop lines of actions. I think we all need to be awake and alert and supportive to the kind of constructive things we can do to keep America safe. Hopefully you all got through to this point in the podcast, because this is a very, very, very important thing for all of us, and we need to be paying attention.
They are perfectly capable of taking advantage of that asymmetry. And I think they must be pinching themselves that they've gotten away with it for as long as they have. And if there's any silver lining, and it's hard to say there can be in a pandemic where, tens of thousands of Americans are losing their lives and many more may yet. But if there is any upside to what's happened here, it is that Rosemary Gibson is being given the kind of hearing she should have gotten 2 years ago. And more to the point, President Trump himself and those of us who've been arguing for a decoupling from the kind of business as usual arrangements that you described, that at a point may have been perfectly reasonable or innocuous. Not anymore. It's not tolerable anymore.
So Rosemary Gibson and Frank Gaffney, who've been voices in the wilderness on this issue, no longer are. And people are listening. And I think one of the things I would recommend highly is reading Rosemary's book, China RX. It's available on Kindle, and it's one of those page turners. And we've touched the tip of the iceberg in this show about what's going on. But also in Rosemary's book, we have a line of actions that she recommends we can take to do something about this. We do hope to get them back on to talk about what these lines of actions will be, and get us all engaged in the solutions. Also, you need to take a look at Frank's work with the Committee for the Present Danger China. A lot of very interesting information on their website. And in particular, it's our focus now on what's happening with the U.S. capital markets and how we've been financing China. And I encourage everyone to take a look at that. Also, we're launching our new The Bill Walton Show website quite soon, and we have a section on it called Interesting People, and both Frank and Rosemary will be profiled with their own page on interesting people. And you can learn more about this and all the other things they're involved with on their page on our website. Also on the website, I'd encourage you to subscribe to future webcasts, take a look at our previous webcasts. There's also an interesting session on where you can provide feedback and comments and suggestions for future shows and guests. And I definitely love the interaction I have with all of you and want to hear more about what you'd like to hear us talk about next. I seem to always forget these promotional plugs, but you can follow us on Spotify and Apple, aka iTunes, or used to be known as iTunes. All this show and all our previous shows will be on there, and so subscribe and listen in and learn along with me. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.